archives, you'll see it, sitting there like a confession they forgot to shred. Kingdom of JUDA on the West African coast. Right there where your ancestors were chained, branded, and shipped. Europe called it slave trade. Africa called it the day they tried to erase Judah from the map by moving Judah across an ocean. Europe said, these are tribes. Africa said, these are nations. Europe said, these are pagans. Africa said, these are priests, prophets, keepers of covenant. They drew you as arrows pointing out of Africa, but the land still whispers your direction back in. Ask yourself, if you were just savages, random Africans, why the need for all that paperwork, all those maps, all those labels, all that church talk to justify the chains? Why mark Judah on the coast if Judah was just some story stuck in the Middle East and Sunday school? Because Europe knows how to lie with ink, but it also knows how to cover itself legally. They left a trail, a name here, a kingdom there, a scribble that says Judah, another that says JUDA. Sound it out. Feel it in your chest. Your spirit knows before your mind catches up. Europe built museums. Africa built memory. Museums charge tickets to see stolen things behind glass. Memory is free and it lives in your blood, your cheekbones, your grandma's accent, the way a drum can make you cry without a single word. Europe gave you textbooks with 3 paragraphs on Africa. Pyramids, slavery, poverty. Africa gave you empires with libraries, kingdoms with court systems, cities with streetlights before Europe had plumbing. Europe handed you a map that said you started in chains. Africa handed you a map that said you started in covenant. So now, you standing between 2 cartographers, one drew you as cargo, one drew you as kingdom. One erased your God and sold you a blonde one. One carved your God into wood, stone, rhythm, and kept him breathing in secret songs and stories. When Europe looks at Africa, it sees resources. When Africa looks at you, it sees relatives. Europe, how do we extract? Africa, how do we remember? Europe, we discovered. Africa, we existed before your boat knew what water was. So when you see Judah on that West African coast, understand, that's not a typo, that's not a coincidence, that's a fingerprint, a breadcrumb, a divine "I told you so" printed in Latin ink on stolen parchment. The same hands that wrote you off, wrote you in. They just hoped you'd never learn how to read between the lines. Because once you see it, once you realize Judah wasn't just over there, but also right here, the whole slave narrative starts to crack. And when the lie cracks, the chains start to rattle. Europe fears that sound. Africa recognizes it. That's the sound of people waking up to maps that accidentally told the truth. Europe said Africa was just tribes and trees. No compass, no kingdoms, no crowns. But then, those old maps start whispering. Not the new ones, polished by professors and colonizers in suits. I'm talking dusty parchment, ink fading, truth still loud. On those maps you see it. Kingdom of Judah sitting in West Africa like it's waiting for roll call. Europe squints, Africa smiles, because Europe spent centuries telling us our story started in a slave ship. No past, no throne, no language, just chains. But those maps, they snitch, they point, they confess. There were people here with names that sound like scripture, laws that sound like Torah, rhythms that sound like psalms. Europe says that's coincidence. Africa says stop lying. Europe drew the lines but couldn't hide the echoes. Judah in West Africa like a fingerprint on the crime scene. Evidence they forgot to burn. So now, the children of the diaspora zoom in, screenshot, enlarge the corner of the coast. Why does this say Judah? Why does this say JUDA? Why does this sound like a name I heard in my grandmother's prayer? Europe hears that question and starts stuttering. Africa hears it and starts humming. because Africa remembers what Europe tried to bury. Names carved in stone, laws carried in blood, stories passed in whispers under moonlight, around fires, behind plantations, inside prison cells. Europe says, "You were heathens." Africa laughs, deep and unbothered. "We were keeping commandments before you could spell civilized." Those old maps are cracked mirrors, and when you hold them up, you don't just see rivers and borders. You see a trail, a pattern, a people pushed from east to west, from known to forgotten, from throne to cargo. Europe edited the textbooks. Africa kept the receipts. So when JUDA shows up on the coast of West Africa, that's not random, that's not cute, that's not a typo, that's a breadcrumb, a flare in the dark. A voice from the past saying, "We were here, we had names, we had law, we had covenant, and you will not erase us with a chapter in your history book." Europe wants you to believe those maps are outdated. Africa knows they're just unfiltered. Old maps, old ink, new eyes, same truth. The story they gave you was too small for the size of your soul. They told you civilization started where their ships landed. Europe, fog, famine, kings choking on silver spoons, plague dancing through stone streets, priests arguing over Latin while rats preached in the alleys. Africa, gold rivers, salt roads, cities lit by libraries, mathematicians counting stars while griots counted generations backwards till the dust turned to names. But in their textbooks, Africa was a blank page with lions. No kingdoms, no scholars, no blueprints, no blue blood. So how JUDA end up on their old maps in West Africa? Because the cartographers weren't as good at lying as the historians. See, a mapmaker got one job: don't get nobody lost. You can't play too many games when sailors' lives and merchants' money depend on your ink. So on those old sheets of skin, before the spin doctors rewrote the world, you see it. Kingdom of JUDA, Wida, Judah, Judah. Right there on the West African coast where your ancestors were chained, tagged, and shipped like cargo. Europe was busy drawing borders with blood, carving the world like a stolen feast. Africa was busy holding lineages, keeping covenants, praying in tongues older than Latin, older than English, older than their flags. They told you the Jews are right over there in the cold lands, in the synagogues of snow and stone. But the, old maps whisper, no, some of JUDA was down here under this sun by this ocean wearing this melanin. They said Africa was heathen, and the map said JUDA lived here. They said you came from nowhere. The map said your name was on the land before your name was on the ledger. They said you were just slaves. The map said you were a people with a covenant, a direction, a destiny, before chains, before auctions, before your tongue was taxed and beaten out of your mouth. Europe wrote stories to make you small. Africa carried memories too big to fit in their footnotes. In Europe, they painted you as shadow, background, beast of burden. In Africa, you were center stage. Queens with crowns heavy as history, kings whose signatures were whole provinces, priests who knew the name of every star their children were named after. So when you see JUDA stamped on West Africa in that old brown ink, under the dust of museum silence, under the breath of colonial lies, under the shrug of school teachers who never saw that before, understand, that's not just a label. That's a leak in the dam. That's truth seeping through the cracks of their paper cage. Because if JUDA was there on that coast at that time in that skin, then the story changes, doesn't it? Then the boats didn't just steal bodies. They stole bloodlines. They didn't just move labor. They moved lineages. Europe, y'all are lucky we civilized you. Africa, we taught the world how to count, how to pray, how to heal, how to build, then watched you pretend we were born yesterday. Old maps don't care about your feelings. They just record coordinates. And those coordinates are pointing fingers now, pointing from their harbors to your history, from their ink to your identity, from From their paper to your power, old ink, new eyes, same truth. They shrunk your story to fit inside their ships, but the coastline still remembers your real name. Europe draws maps like court cases, cold ink, crooked motives, lines like handcuffs, borders like bars. Africa? Africa was a living atlas long before a compass ever touched her skin. Routes in the rivers, coordinates in the drumbeats, history braided in the hairlines of 1,000 tribes speaking one buried memory. So when you see JUDA stamped on old West African maps, under dust, under Latin, under lies, understand this. That's not a typo. That's a confession. Europe mapped what it wanted to steal: gold, grain, bodies, names. They didn't draw you there by accident. Cartographers don't risk their careers on maybe. If JUDA is written on the West African coast, it's because JUDA was there, present, known, talked about in whispers and in merchant ledgers. They told you JUDA lived over there in a storybook desert, far from your cocoa soil and red clay rivers. They pointed east while sailing west. They preached one holy land while looting another. Europe, I discovered. Africa, I remembered. Europe erases you in the classroom, then sells you back your own image in stained glass and cinema. Africa keeps receipts in proverbs, in praise names, in clan totems, in that old woman's song you don't quite understand but feel in your bones. So these old maps, they slipped, they glitched, they let the mask slide for half a second. JUDA on the slave coast, kingdoms with Hebrew echoes in their names and customs, European pens shaking while they wrote what they saw, but didn't fully want to admit. Because if JUDA was in West Africa, then the ships weren't just carrying Africans. They were dragging away princes of psalms, keepers of covenants, children of a promise. They later tried to resell you with a white face and blue eyes. Europe drew maps to own you. Africa lived maps to know you. They charted coastlines, we charted bloodlines. They measured distance, we measured lineage. They sailed by stars, we were the stars. Scattered, but still part of the same constellation. So when you hear them say, JUDA was never in West Africa, ask them, then why does your own map say otherwise? Why do your own archives whisper what your textbooks refuse to shout? New eyes, same truth. Those old maps are not your origin. They're just the moment Europe accidentally admitted you were more than the chains they wrapped you in. They shrunk your story to fit inside their ships, but the coastline still remembers your real name, and the old maps betrayed the secret they tried to bury. Europe drew lines, Africa lived stories. Europe said kingdoms, Africa said family. Europe said tribes, Africa said nations. Europe said slave coast, Africa said home. On their paper, you were ink. On this soil, you were thunder. They sat in cold rooms with candles and compasses, arguing over borders they'd never walked, measuring rivers they'd never tasted, naming lands their feet had never blessed. Meanwhile, Africa was out here breathing kingdoms into the sunrise. Gold talking in the marketplace, drums sending messages faster than any European horse, libraries older than their cathedrals, roads carved by memory, not by maps. Europe mapped what it wanted to steal. Africa lived what it refused to forget. They drew JUDA on the page like a target, but JUDA in West Africa wasn't a dot. It was a drumbeat, a covenant, a people walking scripture in real time. Europe saw trade routes, Africa saw bloodlines. Europe saw resources, Africa saw relatives. Europe saw coastal assets, Africa saw ancestors standing in the surf, refusing to bow even as the ships rolled in like dark omens. Understand this. When you see JUDA scribbled on those old maps, that's not Europe teaching you who you are. That's Africa's echo leaking through their lies. They tried to flatten you to longitude and latitude, but spirit doesn't fit inside straight lines. You can't fold a covenant into a corner of a chart. Europe was busy counting miles, counting cargo, counting coins. Africa was busy counting generations, counting names, counting promises whispered under moonlight. They were mapping land. We were mapping a legacy. So when you line up those maps next to the coastline, you see the clash. Europe's version, cold, neat, numbered. Africa's truth, wild, sacred, remembered. JUDA in West Africa was them slipping up, admitting, we found something here we can't fully explain, so we'll just label it and loot it. But a label ain't a lineage. A border ain't a birthright. Their charts were contracts. Our soil was scripture. And every time their pen wrote JUDA by that coast, the land itself smirked as if to say, you see us, you fear us, you'll trade us, chain us, try to erase us, but you will never unknow us. That's the tension bleeding through those maps. Europe trying to own the narrative, Africa refusing to disappear. Europe draws lines, Africa births worlds. See, Europe loves a border, straight lines, sharp edges, ink like fences pressed onto paper. This is ours, that is theirs, here is the coast, there is the unknown. But Africa don't move like that. Africa is rhythm, not ruler. Spirits, not spreadsheets. Tribes, tongues, kingdoms, clans. Overlapping like drum patterns, weaving like braids on a grandmother's porch. So when you see JUDA stamped on those old maps of West Africa, understand this. Europe was trying to label what it could not own. Trying to box in a people whose story was older than their entire civilization. They saw a JUDA scribbled near the slave coast, and thought they were naming a place, but they were stumbling over a people, a memory, a lineage, a rumor of Israel, breathing in black skin, speaking in tones they did not understand. Europe, we discovered. Africa, we've been. Europe, we mapped. Africa, we remembered. See the game? They drag their ships to our shores, hear echoes of Yehuda, Yuda, Ayuda, and their pens start shaking. Because if JUDA is here, if covenant is here, if prophecy is here, then the story they've been selling is cracked at the foundation. So they do what they always do. Translate it, twist it, rename it, reframe it, until JUDA becomes just another region, another tribe, another curiosity for European journals. But the land knew, the people knew, the elders knew. Those maps are confessions, not just cartography, slips of the tongue in ink form. Europe tried to chart a coastline, but accidentally exposed a bloodline. They thought they were mapping trade routes, but they were tracing exile. They thought they were sketching kingdoms, but they were outlining prophecy. JUDA in West Africa is not some cute coincidence. It's a fingerprint, a clue left at the scene of a buried crime. Because you don't erase a people without first studying them. You don't bury a bloodline without first tracking it. So they tracked, they listed, they mapped, they archived, then they traded, then they chained, then they tried to bury. Europe weaponized the map. Africa survived the map. And even now, centuries later, those faded papers still whisper, you tried to own this story. You tried to rename this people. But your own hand betrayed you. Old maps, old lies, old labels, but the truth walks barefoot, unbothered, across every line they ever drew. Europe drew borders, Africa